Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining the webinar on unlocking the potential of cross-border digital trade services, which is the first of the series on accelerating cross-border paperless trade facilitation for this year, 2022. So in this first webinar, we are going to look closely to the digital trade services area, where the rapid digitalization amidst the COVID-19 pandemic is spurring the growth of services trade. The pandemic has further prompted the transition of economic activities into the digital mode of transactions for a wider range of services. Today's webinar will explore practical ways for the Asia and Pacific region to unlock the great opportunities digital services trade offers for the region's economic development and welfare. Now, let me go ahead with our program and open the floor to the co-organizers' pre-recorded opening remarks. And we will start with Mr. Kijin Kim, economist from the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the ADB, Mr. Oswald Kuller, Managing Director, Digital Standards Initiative, International Chamber of Commerce, and Mr. Jan Duval, Chief Trade Policy and Facilitation Section from Trade Investment and Innovation Division of the UN ESCAP. Ms. Van Aert, please go ahead and launch the pre-recorded interventions from our organizers. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this workshop, Accelerating Cross-Border Paperless Trade, jointly organized by ADB, ESCAP, and ICC. Thank you to all three institutions and research teams for joining this effort. So I'm very honored as a focal for ADB's joint event to say a few words about this great event. Asia has experienced a significant structural transformation over the past decades, shifting towards services. Indeed, service contributes to about 60% of our region's economic activities and employ almost half of the region's labor. One reason is that manufacturing is increasingly relying on services as more and more services enter the manufacturing process as intermediate inputs. For example, automobile companies increasingly contract out engineering services, logistics, and back office to third-party service providers. Manufacturing firms are also providing a whole new range of services to their clients, including after-sales support and marketing, and often moving services. Despite this strong growth, services still represent only a small fraction of total trade. This is partly because of high barriers to trade in services. Asian countries still report much higher restrictiveness than OECD countries. High barriers to entry for foreign firms reduce competition and delay innovation, and the costs are borne by customers and businesses. The COVID-19 pandemic has actually accelerated the transition to digital modes of transactions. More and more services trade is becoming digital and online to overcome high costs of physical engagement. Even after the pandemic, this trend is expected to expand and deepen the scope for Mode 1 services trade, in which a service is produced in one country but consumed in another. To fully take advantage of its full potential, developing economies need to make necessary investments and undertake policy reforms. Among other things, the lack of access to ICT and digital divide remain a main challenge. ADB's recent flagship publication, Asian Economic Integration Report, discusses many related issues, and we are very pleased to present and discuss its main findings. I hope this webinar will help us identify what digital services trade can offer to the region. So once again, thank you very much, and I look forward to fruitful discussions.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Oswald Kuller, and I am the Managing Director of the DSI at the International Chamber of Commerce. The International Chamber of Commerce is the institutional representative of over 45 million companies across the world in over 100 different countries. So we are ultimately across all of the different industries across the globe and across all the various regions. And webinars like today is very important. It's important for us all to come together as a global community and share with each other all of the good and some of the challenges that we're all experiencing as we are all transitioning from analog to digital processes, and also find some inspiration while we're at it. Today's session is really important and very interesting as we can look back a little bit as to how we've transitioned from one way of working 2 years ago to another, a more digitally enabled services environment, where a lot of us have become accustomed to using some of these new tools, and not just our professional lives, but also our personal lives day to day to stay connected with family and friends. I'm really grateful for all of the people who are participating and who are sharing their knowledge and their wisdom, both on a policy and a technological front. And it's really interesting to see where we all will end up at the end of 2020, where we all embrace these digital services and digital trade processes even more in our day-to-day lives. Thanks again and welcome.
On behalf of ESCAP, a warm welcome to all participants and panelists for this 8th webinar in our joint webinar series with ICC and ADB on accelerating cross-border paperless trade. We launched a series back in July 2021 and have covered a wide range of topics since then. Some very technical, such as single window interoperability, some more policy level, such as on the state of play of digital trade facilitation during COVID-19. All the recordings are available online and you're very much welcome to use them. Today's webinar is more policy level and focusing on unlocking cross-border digital services trade. So this is actually a very important topic for accelerating cross-border paperless trade, and possibly especially for developing countries. Indeed, by enabling trade in digital services, countries can gain access to the specialized human resources they really need to develop and run their paperless trade systems, and that at more affordable prices. So trade in digital services can also help build domestic capacity in infrastructure and software development that will underpin paperless trade systems. So at the end of the day, it's useful to keep in mind as well that most of the trade-related data exchanges across borders are business to business and directly depend on availability of digital services. For example, the exporter booking transport and logistics services online and making international payment through private banks. So in short, achieving fully paperless trade transaction can only be achieved by unlocking cross-border digital services trade. So thanks again to ADB for bringing this very interesting and timely topic to the webinar series, and looking forward to learn more from all the senior experts who will speak to us today.
Some highlights that were mentioned were about the acceleration due to the pandemic, acceleration of the digital trade services, and overall all the digitalization aspects regarding the cross-border trade, and all the aspects that are the pillars for the trade facilitation across the borders. Also were very important to highlight the aspects that digital trade services as one of the enablers of the, let's say, cross-border trade, and the facilitation paperless trade needs to have more, let's say, aspects relating to the digital trade services to enable more paperless trade facilitation across the borders. And without going with this short remark, I would like to present the authors of the Asian Economic Integration Report 2022, the relevant section of the digital trade services, Mr. Rolando Avendano, economist from the Economic Research and Cooperation Department of the ADB, and Ms. Pramila Crivelli, economic from the same department of the ADB. Mr. Avendano and Ms. Crivelli, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, and thank you to our colleagues in the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific and the International Chamber of Commerce for this invitation to present the main findings of the 2022 10th chapter of ADB's Asian Economic Integration Report. The AEER is an annual publication that reviews the trends of regional trade, investment, movement of people, and tourism in Asia and the Pacific, all of which are fundamental for the region's economic development and integration efforts. The report this year features a theme chapter on key regional cooperation issues, and this year is dedicated to advancing trade in digital services and the opportunities it offers in light of digital transformation. Let us please start first with a short video showing the key messages of the theme chapter.
Rapid digitalization during the COVID-19 pandemic is expanding opportunities for digital services trade. Cross-border services are increasingly delivered online instead of physically. These include financial, legal, information and telecommunications, health, education, and other business services. Digital services trade can contribute to economic welfare and development. There are many potential synergies between digital services trade and other sectors. Growth in digital services trade in Asia and the Pacific is among the highest in the world. However, digital services trade as a share of total services trade in Asia still has room to grow. Closing the gap requires improving competitiveness in digital services. The region needs to invest more in human capital and ICT infrastructure. Policy and regulatory reforms are the key to higher competitiveness. International cooperation can reduce barriers to digital services trade, promote system interoperability, and ensure fair taxation. Challenges must also be overcome to realize the full potential of digital services trade. Economic and social inequality between those with and without digital skills may worsen. Growing digital services trade calls for renewed attention to cybersecurity and privacy. What does it take to ensure that digital services trade contributes to inclusive growth in Asia and the Pacific? To find out, read the latest Asian Economic Integration Report.
Thank you. Can we project the presentation, please? Thank you. Let's go to the first slide. Thank you. Much has been discussed about international trading services even before the era of digitalization. However, the transformation of services trade remains relatively unexplored. Many services industries, long considered non-tradable, were slower to globalize and to unbundle into global value chains. Digital technologies have steered a powerful new phase for services, lowering intermediary costs and offering opportunities for international division of labor and wage arbitrage. Digitalization has fostered easier, faster, and cheaper transaction of services for both suppliers and consumers. This phenomenon, also known as the third unbundling, has enabled the fragmentation of more specialized tasks to be performed remotely but in real time. As stressed in the introduction by our panelists, the digitalization during COVID-19 has accelerated this phenomenon. Firms are revisiting business models and leveraging on digital technologies. This process might not be fully reversed and represent a structural shift of the region. As shown in the chart, while trading services displayed a steady growth until the arrival of the pandemic, services requiring physical presence, such as travel and transport, were severely affected by tightened cross-border controls and restrictions. In contrast, as we will present, services that could be digitally delivered, such as other business services, were more resilient. Next slide, please. A central question in this discussion is therefore whether digital services can be a vector for economic development. The figure shows the share of digital services exports as a share of total goods and services exports. We observed three things. First, high-income economies tend to have higher export shares in digital services, possibly due to stronger endowments in digital technology and better access to technology. Second, Asian economies have potential to expand export on digital services as a possible development strategy. And third, economic size is not necessarily a precondition for digital services exports on competitiveness. Then, to respond to the question, we adapt to the Frankel and Romer framework to investigate the impact of digital services trade on output and income per capita. Under this approach, we find that increasing bilateral digital services is indeed associated with a rise in output and gross national income per capita. Next slide, please. In terms of scope, official statistics do not allow to separate or to identify what is digitally ordered or digitally delivered trade in services, and reliable global estimates of digitally delivered or Mode 1 trade are not available. However, other initiatives shed light on this phenomenon, in particular on UNCTAD's classification of ICT-enabled services and potentially ICT-enabled services. This is services that, in principle, can be delivered remotely over ICT networks as opposed to those that require physical proximity. Building on these definitions, we consider the scopes of services that can be, in principle, be digitally delivered as largely overlapping with this definition. The concept of broadly ICT-enabled services is therefore equivalent to that of digitally deliverable services, which can be used as a proxy of digitally delivered trade, which we use in this chapter. The table here shows the services categories which are considered to be digitally deliverable based on balance of payment data. And this is the basis of the analysis that we produced for the chapter. Next slide, please. To provide some examples of digitally deliverable services for the 6 main categories presented here, we include here some examples, including both services that are now digitally delivered and also services that are based on ICT technologies. In insurance and pension services, for example, data analytics, big data, and AI are now used for underwriting and pricing of risk. Digitally enabled services include claims management, data management, marketing, and distribution. On financial services, which are driven more and more by digital technologies, they have evolved quickly in the region, and digital payments, e-wallets, credit card services are provided digitally among many countries in the region. Increasingly, other services such as brokerage services, financial management, and financial intermediation are also delivered digitally. In telecommunications, information and computer services are the fastest growing component of the global trade in digital services. They include data transmission, software development, data processing, cloud computing, IT security, and data storage, among others. All these services indicate a strong potential in coming years for growth. Other business services include research and development and professional and management consulting services, which are particularly important for some countries in the region and include legal, accounting, advertising, and management consulting services I mentioned, and also professional services, including engineering, scientific, and architectural services. And finally, in the category of personal, cultural, and recreational services, we include health, education services, creative industries, which are relatively small, but are growing rapidly and have grown importantly during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So what we see is that Asia and the Pacific has played a major role in the expansion of trade in digital services. Digital services trade have expanded, as we explained, thanks to the support of ICT applications and data-driven solutions. From $400 billion in 2005, the region's trade volume has almost tripled to almost 1.4 trillion by 2020 and represent 24% of the global volume. Asia's participation of digital services in total services has also grown rapidly, going from 34% to 55% over the same period, and level that is intermediary when compared to other developing regions. Importantly, digital services trade showed resilience and even growth during the pandemic against a 38% contraction of non-digital services. Next slide, please. If the story of Asia's digital services is generally positive, it also points out to the central role or concentration of some economies in the region emergence as a digital services hub. This is the case of India, PRC, Singapore, Japan, and Korea, which are the most dynamic economies exporting and purchasing digitally deliverable services, as is shown in the figure. While not leading in volume, some developing Asian economies have also experienced substantial growth in digital services trade. Economies with a significant growth are, for example, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Laos, Nepal, and the Philippines. This suggests that there is some potential for other economies, including developing member countries, to exploit better these opportunities. Let me now give the floor to Pramila for the second part of the presentation. Over to you, Pramila.
Thank you very much, Rolando. Thank you to the organizer for having me today. So as explained by, next slide, please. So yeah, as explained by Rolando, many economies in Asia and the Pacific are still at a nascent stage of developing a digital services exporting sector that is competitive. So in closing the gap with advanced economies, the vision is to focus on the main drivers of digital services trade, which are, among others, human capital development, digital connectivity, ICT investment, and enabling policy and regulatory environments. In fact, the length of education is associated with greater trade in digital services, and the importance of upskilling and reskilling the workforce cannot be overstated. Developing Asia, digital services exports hinge largely on the availability, accessibility, and affordability of high-quality broadband services. And on this front, the region's rapid growth of mobile penetration bodes well. Next slide, please. The region needs also to embrace further efforts for domestic deregulation, trade liberalization, and international cooperation. As it has been mentioned in the opening statements, there are still a lot of barriers to digital services trade. And for the 17 Asian economies with available OECD data on the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, the DSTRI, the total number of restrictions increased from 138 in 2015 to 153 in 2020. And with barriers related to cross-border data flow accounting on average for around 20% over the period. Next slide, please. So based on the computational general equilibrium model, using the ADB multi-regional input-output data, we have simulated the impact of two scenarios: a trade liberalization scenarios and a domestic deregulation scenario. And under each scenario, the model measures the spillover impact on trade and income across sectors when you have 10% of transaction costs that are reduced for digital services sectors. Okay. Now, we measure this impact, as I mentioned, on trade flows, GVC linkages, and aggregate real income. Next slide, please. The exercise points to sizable economic gains from trade liberalization and the regulation of the digital services sector. In fact, while the trade liberalization and the regulation scenarios generate significant increase in both backward and forward GVC linkages, in these sectors, specifically the sectors that have been shocked, the DDS sectors that you can see in the red dashed line, it can also lead to stronger GVC linkages of other manufacturing and services sectors through the spillover impact. Well, you see this, that you have impact in all sectors, although the digitally deliverable sectors are only those that are highlighted in red. So Yeah, so that can be seen there in the line. Next slide, please. The digital services trade is also heavily reliant on the transmission of data across economies. So using a difference in difference approach, comparing digital services and non-digital services sectors, we have estimated the impact of 3 types of data flow restrictions on Asia's trade versus other regions' trade. So the data localization means data processing is required entirely in the host economy without repatriation allowed, while local storage means at least a copy of the processed data should be stored locally. And finally, the conditional flow means that data can be transferred under certain conditions like customer consent. So these data-related restrictions raise costs for companies to conduct business across borders and lead to lower levels of digital services imports compared to non-digital sectors. And this is even more so the case for Asian economies, where the portion of the data localization measures is in fact larger than in the rest of the world. And this can be seen in the table you have on the screen, where you see that the coefficient on Asia is significant and negative. Next slide, please. The results that I've just mentioned from the general equilibrium model or from the empirical analysis using econometric panel data shows that the importance of regulation of digital services trade and these regulations can take place at different levels: multilateral, regional, and domestic. At the multilateral level, the main obligations of the regulation of digital trade under existing WTO legal framework can be found in the Telecom Annex of the GATT, the General Agreements on Trading Services. But some key considerations remains. The first one is the classification of the products. Trading a good or a services has important implications on the application of border measures versus domestic regulations. So it's important to classify the good or the services properly. Second, the degree of liberalization can vary a lot, significantly from non to unbound. And finally, you may have exceptions that allow deviations from trade obligations for legitimate policy reasons. So this is for the multilateral framework. Now, in regional trade agreements or in regional agreements, there are 3 main sovereign approaches adopted by the US, the PRC, and the EU. And these approaches are balancing in different ways the interests of the main stakeholders that are the consumers, the private sectors, and the governments. This approach can serve, and in fact have served, as reference for the negotiations of new trade agreements or renegotiations of existing ones. Next slide, please. To assess the state of play in Asia and the Pacific, we conducted a mapping of the main RTAs, regional trade agreements in the region, that contain chapters on e-commerce or digital trade since 2000. And the mapping groups digital trade provisions into 4 categories: trade facilitation, enabling business, consumer protection, and regulatory autonomy. The results that you have on screen show that both the number of agreements and the digital provisions have been increasing over the last decades. And among the 4 categories that I've just mentioned, the first one, trade facilitation, is the most common, with in fact more than 75% of the regional agreements that include at least 2 provisions in this category. And overall, 26% of the FTAs include provisions in all 4 categories. Next slide, please. At the national level, services domestic regulations include a wide range of important areas such as transparency, the regulation, qualification requirements and procedures, technical standards, and licensing requirements. It also needs to be acknowledged that digital economy raised additional difficulties. how to ensure transaction safety, how to prevent cybercrime, how to ensure confidentiality and integrity. These are issues that need to be addressed, and they are addressed by cybersecurity regulations at the domestic level. It might be quite challenging, though, as it is not always easy to distinguish sometimes between legitimate policy objectives and protectionism. And in particular, this is even more challenging for developing economies given the lack of adequate regulatory framework and limited human and financial capacity. Finally, and importantly, while these economies adopt domestic services regulations and also cybersecurity regulations individually, the cross-border nature of the digital services trade still requires international cooperation. And this can take the form of mutual recognition agreements that can be formalized, for example, at the WTO in plurilateral negotiations, or it can be translated into informal arrangements. But cooperation is still needed to align domestic regulations and policies. Next slide, please. Digitalization has enabled firms to deliver services digitally. We discussed that, but it also created scope for distortions of the tax rules. Unilateral measures such as digital services taxes, the DSTs, or could potentially prompt retaliatory measures, including tariffs or other barriers to trade. The multilateral corporate tax agreements reached last October, including a new taxing regime without physical presence and minimum corporate tax rate, is a turning point in this area. Regional cooperation will be then essential to adapt these national tax regimes by 2023 when the agreement enters into force. Meanwhile, economies in the region can consider other measures, such as expanding value-added tax on digital transactions to also include imported digital services. And as new tax rules are gradually implemented, the year effects on competition and investments will also need to be further assessed. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the presentation. I would like to give you the main policy recommendations of these chapters. The first one is therefore that economies need investment, not only in ICT infrastructure and connectivity, but also in human capital to strengthen their digital capacity. Reducing internal and external costs, so those are the two scenarios we discussed earlier, of trade in digital services through the regulation of the services sector and trade liberalization could strengthen GVC participation and translate into significant real income gains through direct effects, and also all the spillovers effect we have seen in the previous graph on the economy as a whole. The economies need to assess and balance their interests between safeguarding the cybersecurity, data protection, and privacy on the one hand, but also to support freer trade data flow on the other hand, as we have seen that it is crucial to enable business to operate. Economy level regulatory frameworks and reforms should be complemented by international cooperation. This is key. In particular, plurilateral initiatives, regional trade agreements, digital economy partnership agreements, international tax cooperation, and mutual recognition agreements can be instrumental in achieving transparent, fair, and harmonized regulations, and also taxation and liberalization systems. Finally, and most importantly, in this process, the governments should take into account the possible differential impact and trade-offs. For example, think of skilled or unskilled workers or urban or rural areas, because as we know, wages and prices can be affected differently between the type of workers and between the sectors. So governments should take that into account when they try to foster competitiveness of the digital services across the society, while addressing the digital divide and distributional impact. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avendano, Ms. Crivelli, for this insightful and comprehensive dive into the digital services trade sector. You have mentioned so many important aspects that, as you have also summarized, all those aspects. And they are very important for the Asia region. And as you mentioned, that one of the main areas of the trade services that are have been increasing from 2005 is the transport and travel that have the highest peaks. And also you mentioned also those aspects regarding the direct links and indirect links between the volume of the economy and the export in digital services, which is also important. And what are the persistent challenges for Asia, such as low productivity and competitiveness, high regulatory barriers? You have mentioned what would be the impact of the positive impact of the deregulation on international level and liberalization also on national level. Those aspects are also very important to mention always when we are looking to these aspects. Of course, it is very important also when we are defining on national, international level the definition of those categories of the digital services and digital deliverables. You mentioned that different international stakeholders have done interesting work on that and have defined exactly all those aspects. So without going too much in detail, to mention just that in Asia Pacific, we can in Asia, in the Pacific region, we can look to the different aspects where the governments can do a further work to progress in those aspects in the deregularization, and what could be the impacts of the international agreements on the regional level, international conventions, how we can impact positively on the progress and economic increase in those areas. Before going ahead with the program, I would like to mention that for the participants that all the questions regarding your presentation can be directly sent to the Q&A chat box, and they will be picked up later after the next session, and they will be addressed directly in the Q&A session. On this short note, I would like just to, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Jong-Woo Kang, Principal Economist in Economic Research and Cooperation Department of the ADB, who will be moderating the next session. Mr. Jong-Woo Kang, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be joined by 4 esteemed panelists for this panel discussion session today, who will be discussing the major opportunities and the challenges in unlocking the great potential the digital service trade offers for the region. I'd like to ask the 4 esteemed panelists to turn on their video now, and then I'll just try to briefly introduce each one of them before we start our panel discussion. So first, Dr. Rupa Chanda is the Director of the Trade Investment Innovation of the ESCAP, and prior to her current position, she was a Professor of Economics at the IIM Bangalore and the Dean of the Programs at that institute. She was worked as an economist at IMF and briefly served as head ESCAP's regional office for South and Southwest Asia in New Delhi. And she has undertaken research and professional assignments for international and Indian organizations and has published extensively in the form of books, journal articles, book chapters, among others. The speaker I'd like to introduce to you next is the Professor Jane Drake Brockman, who is the very widely published and internationally recognized expert on trade and development, global value chains and the regional integration, and one of Asia and the Pacific's foremost experts on trade and competitiveness in services. Former senior diplomat and the trade negotiator, she held the position of chief economist in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Chartered Affairs at the Australian delegation to the EU in Brussels. She founded and co-chairs the Asia Pacific Services Coalition. Our next speaker is the Professor Henry Gao, who is the Associate Professor of Law at Singapore Management University and Dongfang Scholar Chair Professor at the Shanghai Institute of Foreign Trade. Widely published on issues relating to China and WTO, he has advised many national governments as well as the WTO, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, APEC, and ASEAN on trade issues. He sits on the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program. Last but not least, Mr. Oswald Quiller is the managing director who has kindly delivered his opening remarks during the opening session. And then he's with the International Chamber of Commerce, as we all know, and he's focused on the further the enabling of the trade digitization through the creation of the standards at the International Chamber of Commerce. He's the former head of data strategy of PHP, the world's largest diversified mining company. He has worked on initiatives covering blockchain, electronic documentation, and trade data and analytics and automation. Before BHP, he was on the leadership team of EOH-MS in South Africa, delivering solutions for a diverse customer base globally. With that, for the first round of the intervention from our esteemed four panelists, I'd like to ask each speaker to talk for around 3 to 4 minutes, focusing on some relevant aspects of the issues on the digital service trade. First, let me start with Rupa, if I may. Perhaps you can focus on because I understand you have conducted some survey exercises, and also you have been one of the key contributors to the flagship report on the digital service trade. So based on your research and the survey exercises, I'd like to listen to your observations on the key factors affecting different development stages of digital service trade across the countries in the region, and the potential policy implications drawn from your survey exercise. So over to you, Rupa.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to present some of the findings. Actually, I have some visuals which are in a supplementary PowerPoint, but maybe there won't be enough time, so I'll just skip those for now. So as has been highlighted, the Asia-Pacific region plays a very important role in global digital as well as within that ICT services exports. But of course, there is a lot of heterogeneity within the region, even though the region is well integrated digitally, but it's not uniform across the different parts of the region. And also, if you look at it from a sustainability angle, you'll find that perhaps not all countries do very well. I'll come back to that issue later. Also, from a digital services restrictiveness point of view, as has been mentioned by Pramila, there is a tendency towards growing restrictions. Now, for this particular study that was done for this integration report, we actually selected 6 countries to try and be representative from within the region. So the countries selected were China, Fiji, India, Indonesia, Mongolia, and the Philippines. And basically the idea was to look at what are the features, what are the characteristics, and what can we understand about some of the enablers and constraints to digital services trade across a variety of countries, and what are those commonalities and differences that emerge. So what came out from the study is that basically you can classify sort of 3 groups of countries, at least from this set of 6. And I think that's instructive. One is the set of, well-established sort of mature exporters of digital services. So for instance, India and Philippines, I would say, came in that category. But they also have a much more diversified set of exports, from the traditional sort of BPO call center contact services to more customized, more domain specific, professional services. Then you have very distinctive exporters like China, whose advantages come from a very different source. It's not like they are particularly competitive in services, although they are large exporters of services and of digital services, but the competitiveness comes from the wider growth of the digital economy in general, and comes from the core competitiveness in manufacturing. So a lot of the digital services growth is a spin-off from services being embedded in the manufacturing value chain, or from the general growth in the economy itself of digital business. And another very interesting driver of the exports in the Chinese case was outward investments. There's a lot of investment that is happening from China into various digital businesses in other parts, and along with that, many digital services are also getting exported. So it's a very different model from the kind that we see for India and Philippines, which is largely driven by the cost arbitrage, human resource capital, domain-specific skills. And then you have the other countries which are showing potential, but perhaps not growing fast enough. Their scale is also much smaller. So there, Indonesia, Mongolia, and Fiji, of course, was just more of a BPO sort of services exporter. But Indonesia was interesting because what you find is, again, there is a lot of potential because of the huge growth of the domestic digital economy, which could be leveraged to actually become a digital services exporter within the region, especially the Southeast Asia region. And Mongolia was interesting because you actually saw investments from East Asia, from Japan, Korea, which were using Mongolia as a small sort of pilot case to test out various applications and services, which then could potentially be leveraged to export to the region, to similar countries, for instance, in Central Asia. So you found very different sorts of factors and enables, very different competencies. But what clearly emerged is that there is room here for a variety of countries to engage in digital services. It's not necessary that being small is a disadvantage. You can actually use it to establish yourself in particular sub-regional markets or in certain niche services. If you're a very large exporter with a lot of scale, you might be riding the cost advantage, but what you find is that gradually they are the ones who are having to move away from the traditional services into more advanced AI-based, data analytics kind of services. And then there are countries which are leveraging the competencies in other parts of their economy, like the case of China, and bundling digital services trade along with Mode 3 exports, for instance, outward investments. So when I look across all of this, basically 4 broad enabling pillars come out: human capital and related aspects of skills and expertise. Second is telecom infrastructure and other aspects related to digital readiness. It's not just about infrastructure, but it's digital connectivity as well as quality, etc. Then there's the innovation and entrepreneurial environment. So the presence of digital enterprises, the startup culture, what sort of R&D activity and related regulations, regulatory sort of the approval processes, the exit and entry of such enterprises. There's a variety of policies around that. And then you have the business environment more generally on trade and investment, data-related regulations. And these 4 pillars are sort of interdependent. When one looks at the correlations actually across countries, it comes out very clearly that human capital and growth in digital services is very positively related. Similarly, telecom readiness, infrastructure quality are, regulatory quality is, and similarly the startup environment. So while I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship, but clearly these go together. So a lot of good policy implications come out of that. Basically, governments have a strong role to play, even though countries may have natural advantages based on their location, geographic nature, and so on. Governments have a role to play in terms of fiscal incentives, incubation support, digital literacy and adoption, e-commerce regulations, startup regulations, and so on. And again, here, I think governments have been quite proactive. If you look across these countries as representative cases, you do find national strategies and roadmaps which are trying to develop the digital economy. They are focusing on telecom infrastructure and connectivity, skilling for a digital economy, incubation, and the whole startup sort of funding, etc. But there are gaps also. There's more of a focus on traditional sort of aspects of, scaling up people for the digital economy or engaging in the IT sector, very traditional skills, but they're not really anticipating the sort of needs of the industry in future. They're not focusing enough on MSMEs and digital adoption. Similarly, on connectivity, on telecom infrastructure, it's more basic. It's about, just getting the connectivity, but it's not looking ahead at issues of data storage, security, costs sufficiently. On startup culture and so on, many countries still don't have regulatory sandboxes. They don't have proper policies for entry and exit of startups. And what the worrying thing actually is there's an increasingly cautious and protectionist sort of approach in digital services regulations. Here one sees overall a protectionism growing. And also another thing to note is that perhaps there isn't enough recognition yet of the linkage between digital services imports and exports. I think both countries which are showing rapid growth of exports are also showing rapid growth of imports. So there must be a supporting role here in terms of the general growth of the digital economy, and especially the role of business services and professional services. So related, liberalization of regulatory restrictions in these areas, I think becomes very important if you want to support digital services trade. So taking from all this, basically, the main point I'd like to say is that, digital services trade provides a great opportunity for countries to integrate into both global and regional value chains. It's a great way to embed them in the manufacturing value chain, even if you're not directly exporting in a big player in manufacturing. And it's actually an opportunity for countries of all types in terms of scale, geographies, initial conditions, and so on. So the competitiveness areas may be very different for different countries. And there's a lot of scope with the right policies to enable social and economic convergence. It needn't aggravate the digital divide. Coming to the issue of paperless trade and how digital services actually can enable that, as was mentioned right at the beginning, I think we need to look at greater interoperability between countries. In digital services, we find that, in terms of regional integration in digital trade, there is a lot of heterogeneity. And in digital services also, there's quite a variety in terms of the restrictions. So maybe more discussion through either regional agreements, bilateral agreements, where we are looking at in the chapters on cooperation, e-commerce, R&D, investments. I think the digital services part has to be brought in more clearly. We also have, in the context of ESCAP, the framework agreement on facilitation of cross-border paperless trade. So here again, this is a mechanism to promote interoperability. So we could also discuss digital services integration here. And finally, a point that's been made many times, that digital services exports is one thing, digital services as an enabler of trade more generally, because of the role of supporting business and professional or financial, accounting, all of these services that go hand in hand with goods trade. If you facilitate digital services in general and facilitate digital services trade, it will also help digital goods trade, right? And the capacity and so on that gets developed in the process will be beneficial for trade in general. So I think the synergies between services and goods trade are very clear in the context of a digital integration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupa. Thank you very much for your delineating the three country groupings based on the each and every country's resource endowment and the development status of the digital service trade, and also what would be the main drivers of digital service trade, covering the human capital, digital readiness, and entrepreneurship, and the general business enabling environment, among others. So those factors should be the major drivers of digital service trade. But at the same time, there are some other aspects of the issues related to digital service trade and its development, which is so-called regulatory, and not only national but the international regulatory environment, and through which many of digital services businesses can be affected, and also why we don't have enough amount of international cooperation to nurture the enabling environment for the digital service trade in the region and around the globe. So my next question to Jane is to focus on these types of international cooperation related issues at large. So, and over to you, Jane, please.
Okay, thank you, Jong-woo, and thank you to all the host organizations for the opportunity to join this discussion. And I must say congratulations to the ADB on this year's Asian Integration Report and its focus on digital services, because really it's not an easy topic. And the main reason is nobody's really done this before. It's a bit of a global first, and it's a very welcome initiative. Now, Rupa has drawn on the case studies and the report's analysis of the drivers of competitiveness to outline quite a significant domestic action agenda. But Jong-woo's quite right. The report definitely also maps out a very comprehensive agenda for international cooperation, and the video and the ADB presentation highlighted this. Now, what we all know is that a vital ingredient in all regional economic integration efforts at whatever level is a degree of international cooperation. Indeed, it's probably true that international cooperation is a necessary condition for success. So it's worth asking, traditionally across all sectors, what does that usually mean? Because if we remember what's generally required in all sectors, I think it might help us see more clearly what is most urgent and most different about the needs in this area for digital services. So normally we would say for any sector that it means focusing on all the glitches that arise at the borders between trading partners. And these days at all the glitches and interconnection problems that arise at the linkage points in value chains. This would generally involve dialogue, even negotiations around trade liberalisation at the border. It would generally involve establishing mechanisms to promote trade flows or to go further and facilitate trade flows by aligning local practices to simplify and reduce the costs of doing international business. And it would usually also involve some kind of effort to reduce all the discrepancies in all the standards which traded goods and services have to meet. So there would be some kind of cooperative effort needed to harmonise or mutually recognise each other's different ways of doing things. Now then, when we come specifically to trade in services, we know that it's even more important to focus behind the border at domestic regulatory regimes because services industries tend to be heavily regulated. So international cooperation would usually focus a bit more on sharing of information and technical assistance around regulatory coherence, regulatory efficiency, best regulatory practices, and it might even involve development cooperation around regulatory institution building. So to answer John Woo's question, you know, how does all that translate when we're thinking specifically about digital services? And I think that the top priorities which fall out of the ADB's research are, first, we have to reduce the very high and growing degree of digital regulatory heterogeneity across the region. The fact that it is growing and getting worse means it's urgent. This means governments need to pay special attention in the process of building their digital industries to avoiding data-related regulations that hinder cross-border data flows. The ADB modelling was quite clear in identifying large negative effects from such regulations on digital services trade. Now, how do governments do this? They need to get together in the regional and multilateral fora that exist, including the WTO and the ISO and the ITU, to agree on some basic governance arrangements for e-commerce and digital trade. They do need to work together to develop and implement international digital standards on everything, on cybersecurity, on privacy, on the ethics of artificial intelligence, on cloud computing. The key objective behind many of these standards is to build greater business and consumer trust in the online environment. And governments need to do this in a concerted manner that allows cross-border businesses to prosper. The second big thing that I think falls out of the report is that governments need to be building into their bilateral and regional trade agreements provisions that call specifically for regulatory cooperation and provide forums for getting on with that regulatory cooperation, either as part of those agreements, and we do see that in the digital economy agreements, or in other existing institutions. We need forums for regulators to get together. Regulators need to focus together on ways of achieving greater interoperability in the way we do everything in the digital space. Now, where digital standards do differ across jurisdictions, as they absolutely do, and as I said, it's getting worse, the report calls for establishment of open and non-discriminatory mechanisms that allow for mutual recognition of adequacy, if not equivalence. It's early days, but efforts are underway in Geneva in the work on e-commerce, in the digital economy agreements springing up in the region, and everyone needs to be participating more than they are. The ADB has one very crystal clear policy message. It calls for liberalisation of trade in digital services, especially computer services, so computer software, cloud computing, data storage, etc., where the region has seen, if I remember this right, an 8-fold increase in trade in computer services over the last 15 years. Also, they argue in ICT services and in a wide range of fast-growing professional and business services, as well as cultural, recreational, and personal services such as health and education, all of which are online. The report also says that ultimately all services sectors have the potential to go digital, and what that means is the liberalisation effort should actually focus on all services and especially electronic delivery, which is a bit of a new focus for international cooperation in services. And the reason the ADB argues this is because it sees digital services as being a key ongoing contributor to regional growth and development. I'll leave it there, Jong-Woo, and there's an opportunity I can come.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. So having played the key role in the structuring our theme chapter of the report and then embedding the key messages, working with us together. So Jane has become the even better advocate of our report than ourselves, I think. Thank you very much on that front. So she has covered very important issues about the international cooperation and the importance of the regulation and the liberalization. And for example, promoting the mutual recognition arrangement or agreement, those are very much well instilled in our report. So if you have any curiosity on this issue, please have a look. So with that, I'd like to move on to Henry. We have also borrowed your idea on the three key stakeholder approaches, which can be used as a good benchmark for many countries which are trying to develop the enabling environment for the digital service trade. So perhaps you can share with us your insights about this legal framework and also in the context of the data flow restriction, depending upon the framework each and every country has adopted so far. Thank you, Henry. Over to you.
Thank you, Jong-Woo, and congratulations to you and your colleagues on the launch of the Asian Economic Integration Report. And I also am pleased and honored to be able to contribute to the report. So for the discussion on the legal framework, I would focus on the three different paradigms that are emerging. And in particular, I will focus on three questions. Basically, who are the actors which are involved in the regulation? What are the regulatory approaches of the three representative approaches? And why do we have such different approaches? Now, first of all, I think we need to understand that there are three main groups of players which are involved in data regulation. The individual consumer, which provide the data and also use the data, the e-commerce firm, which process the data and also store the data, and the state, which regulates the use of the data. So these three different groups have a very different interests. If we look at the individual, we can see that for the individual, the top concern they will normally have is the protection of personal information and privacy. While the firm, their main interest seems to be on making sure that the flow of trade and data will not be subject to unnecessary government regulations. But these sometimes could come against the interests of the state, which where many states has been emphasizing on the need to regulate the data. because of the security considerations. So if we look at the dynamics between the three different groups, we can see that the different dynamics we see in different jurisdictions shape the divergent regulatory approaches, which also make it difficult to agree on a uniform set of rules on e-commerce regulation at the international level. So if you look at countries around the world, while all regulators would agree on the need to try to strike a balance between the clashing interests of the three different groups of stakeholders, their approaches often differ in practice. So some jurisdictions, as we see, would prioritize the need to safeguard the privacy of users. A good example in this regard is the EU, which has the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, which recognizes the protection of a natural person in relation to the processing of personal data as a fundamental right. So they basically put the interests of the consumers first. On the other hand, some jurisdictions put the commercial interests of the firms first. And this is the case of the United States, that is reflected in its 1996 Telecommunication Act, which knows that the policy of the US to preserve free market and fettered by federal or state regulation. So basically here, you can see that they put the priority on the firm. In contrast, national security concerns are often cited to justify restrictions on cross-border data flows, even though the degrees could vary in different countries. A recent example we could find is China's recent laws on cybersecurity and data security, which impose severe restrictions aiming to safeguard cybersecurity, protect the cyberspace, sovereignty, and national security. These divergent approaches are also reflected in the trade agreements concluded by the three main players. And these divergent approaches are not unique to these three players. Instead, as we can see from several studies, they have kind of permeated around the world, with basically countries around the world adopting one of the three models. So why do we have the divergent approaches? I would argue this is mainly because of two reasons. First of all, the commercial interests of the different players are different. So if you look at the global e-commerce market, you can see that they are largely dominated by China and the US. Among the top 10 digital firms in the world, 6 are American firms and 4 are Chinese firms. But the American firms are the ones which mainly trade in data. So these would be firms like Facebook, Google, Netflix, and they don't really sell physical products. While the Chinese firms on the list are big firms like Alibaba and JD.com, which still sell predominantly physical goods. So that is why the US focus on the digital side and argue for the free flow of data, because that really help to protect the interests of US firms, while China really focus on the traditional trade side when it comes to digital trade, as I have discussed before in other papers. But for the EU, if you look at the EU don't really have major players in the game. So actually, some people have argued that the reason why the EU has such a strict privacy and personal information protection law is a sort of a digital protectionism to try to fend up the invasions of the Americans and Chinese firms into Europe. The second reason is that different domestic regulatory approaches. In the US, the development of the e-commerce and the digital trade sector has long benefited from its permissive legal framework, which aims to minimize government regulation on the internet and relies heavily on self-regulation by the firms in the sector itself. While in China, you say that for a long time, there has been a strong tradition of heavy government regulation, which started from regulation of hardware and then to the regulation of the software, and nowadays even to the data that is transmitted online. While the EU, if you look at the case of the EU, they have a long tradition of a human rights protection, and this is mainly in response to the atrocities of the Second World War. So that is why they will recognize, for example, personal information and privacy as a fundamental human right, rather than just as a commercial right, as in the case of the US, where you only get such a right if you are consumer of a certain business sector, but if you are not consumer, you do not get such a right. So it is really interesting to see the emergence of the three different models. And as I mentioned, this does make it difficult for countries to agree to a common approach at the international level. But I hope that as countries recognize that in the end, have less restrictions on digital trade would benefit everyone, maybe hopefully they would come to some conclusion and compromise in the global negotiations, such as in the WTO joint statement initiative negotiations on e-commerce. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you very much for your comprehensively delineating three different approaches which have been adopted by various countries so far. So there was one interesting question in the Q&A box on how to balance the data flow restrictions and then data localization requirement and the privacy and the data protection. That question I will go back to you again later. At this moment, I'd like to move on to Oswald, who is with ICC, and I would like to listen to your views and insights on whether the businesses are feeling any pinches or any the hurdles or bottlenecks in terms of the doing businesses due to some major regulatory bottlenecks on the digital services business or digital service trade. So over to you, Oswald.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Jane, and everyone for your insights. I've personally learned quite a bit today, so thank you. I do know we're short on time, so what I might do is just hit on a few notes, but again, do submit any questions in the chat box. I think from the business community, there's a few things that I would like to highlight in the next 2 or 3 minutes. The first one is whether we're talking about digitization of trade or services, or goods or services. From a regulatory landscape point of view, there's a lot of work still to be done to try and harmonize regulation globally. And so when we think about some of the UNCITRAL model laws on e-commerce, e-signature, electronic transferable records, the adoption of these have enormous value because they help simplify some of the challenges that organizations face, especially when they deal with large, complex supply chains across multiple borders. And so having that level of harmonization, across the regulatory frameworks truly do help companies, not just the big ones, but the small ones know how to navigate some of those complexities. The second one is, as we're looking, and I was looking at a data point earlier today of just how many policy changes there were last year, and I saw over 361 data governance policy changes were made last year, specifically in response to some of the privacy requirements globally. And so you can imagine if you're a student out of varsity and you're trying to produce a brand new service and you're trying to navigate this global landscape, that's quite challenging. It's very difficult to have a look at that complicated landscape and get a sense of how do you align or comply to all the various challenges out there. And what the internet has done is it's removed to a large extent a lot of the borders across companies. So again, harmonization on that front through some of the standard authorities and bodies working together with industry is going to be very, very important. Now, when I think about the future, I mean, when we think about just the last 2 years, there's been a lot of activity on, legal reforms globally on how do we ensure that we have e-commerce, e-signature, electronic transferable records, all of these in place to start removing some of the challenges. But I do fear that if we have a look at kind of what's coming next, we might still be playing catch up over the course of the next 2 to 3 to 4 years on some of the new innovations that are coming out there. We can see industry clouds coming. That's going to be cross-border, enabling multiple services per industry globally. It's on the latest Gartner hype cycle, and their view is that that's about 5 years out. And so when we think about the ability for various industries to start producing services together across country borders, how do we ensure that the semantics and the requirements from a governance and a data point of view is there so that it's not just the 2 or 3 or 4 that succeed large multinational tech companies, but that we give some of our local talents a fighting chance in producing some of these services. We can see things like the metaverse popping up, and a lot of people look at that and go, that sounds a little bit funny and a little bit crazy that people are buying property online. But the reality is that while we're talking about how do we ensure that, you know, connectivity on services are still happening on web pages, you know, some of the new innovations out there is actually starting to transition into this new virtual landscape. And so I think at the end of the day, it boils down to a few key things. How do we make it simple so that both large and small companies can get a sense of these are the requirements I need to align to? How do we ensure that when we have talent, which regardless as to which country they are in, that they can get a sense of what is this landscape, how do I navigate it, and how do I produce my service in a way that truly scales across borders so that I can actually be successful? And then finally, how do we work with government so that as we are looking at either regulatory changes or even looking at trade agreements, digital economy agreements, etc., how do we, instead of potentially sometimes, you know, as governments, how do we, instead of potentially building our own services or sometimes overstepping a little bit, how do we actually ensure that as we're doing pilots and prototypes, we're actually educating our local markets on those semantic requirements to ensure that whatever is produced actually scales, and it doesn't just scale in our local economies, but cross-border. So I think from our side, it's all about simplicity. You know, margins are thin, businesses are struggling, and so any complexity out there is either going to be ignored, avoided, or, you know, is just going to stop people from producing services or businesses that can help all of us succeed in the future. So looking forward to the conversation a little bit later. But I do believe that we're all stronger together. And so it's businesses plus standard authorities plus government agencies all working together to have a look and actually solve some of these data requirements as a collective unit as opposed to in a siloed approach. But thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Thanks for your time. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this journey takes us in the next 2 to 3 years. I'm hoping it's not what we've seen with our blockchain journey, where 5, 6 years ago, you know, there was this magical thing called blockchain and people weren't entirely sure how to leverage it. And 5 years later, we recognize that standards and policy is actually required to help us succeed in that space. So let's do standards and policy and semantics well, support our local communities and build great businesses. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Oswald. Thank you very much. It's very interesting to listen to your views about what's going to happen in the future, what lies ahead. For example, I mean, the industry cloud and the metaverse, I'm pretty much sure that I'll be getting the telemedicine, telehealth services through the metaverse universe in the years to come. So I hope that that kind of future will come to us sooner rather than later for the convenience of all of us. The picking up on what you have just said about some bottlenecks arising from the heterogeneity of regulations. I mean, more than 300 regulatory changes happened in the past year or so. So picking up on that, I'd like to listen to Jane's view about whether we can think about some ways to overcome this kind of digital regulatory bottlenecks through some policy instruments available. So over to you, Jane.
Oh, thank you, Jong-woo. I was thinking there's also a question in the Q&A there about how do we achieve, you know, harmonized digital regulatory arrangements, similar sort of question to the one you've just asked. And look, there are two things I would say, and that is that we should remember that we do now have a new WTO reference paper on services domestic regulation, which sets out principles for good regulatory practice across all services, but that includes digital services. And I do think that one mechanism is that for all WTO members to have a look at those principles and, you know, even if they're not ready to bind them in their schedules, to start the process of working through them and implementing them. For the 14 regional economies in the OECD data, the estimate is that implementation of those principles could deliver a 7% reduction in trade costs in services. And when you look at the subset that's digital services, it skyrockets. I mean, in financial services, it's something like a 32% trade cost cut that you could achieve just by signing on to those principles. So I would mention that. And the other thing is, you know, why standards are so important. International standards and participating in those international processes is so much more important than developing indigenous standards, because if you go your own unilateral way and your businesses all sign up to the local standard, then you're going to spend the next 20 years negotiating and failing to negotiate a mutual recognition agreement with your trading partners who've done the same thing. It is really important to think very early about international digital standards. So they're two very big mechanisms. But, you know, John Woo, if I could just say, I do agree with Henry that it's not straightforward or easy, this cooperation that's required. But let me just remind everyone how worth pursuing it is. I mean, we heard Pramila and Rolando tell us that over the last 15 years, trade in digital services in the region has exceeded that of non-digital services and of total services. And that Asia and the Pacific might have started from a low base, but we are right at the forefront with the world's fastest rate of growth in this sector. I mean, a good 2 percentage points higher than the rest of the world. And this is a widespread story. I think Rolando mentioned, or maybe John Woo, you did, Bangladesh, Laos, Nepal, some of the Pacific Islands. This is everywhere. And it might be difficult and unfamiliar, but there's no time to waste.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. So we are a bit behind schedule, but we are already engaging the questions from the floor. So we can save some of time from that section. So my last question to Rupa will be, I mean, where the country should start from. For example, many of the countries in the region are in a nascent stage of developing the digital service. Where should they start from? So that will be my last question to you. But before then, there is one interesting question in the Q&A box, which will be directed to Henry, for example. So the question is, when you recommend balancing the data protection needs with data flows, what is the minimum standard of data localization measures? This is pretty much a challenging question, but I hope that we can benefit from the wisdom of Henry. Henry, over to you, please.
Thank you, John Woo, for raising this really interesting question. And I think it's Ms. Sohel who asked the question. So this is a really good question because it actually gave me the opportunity to further elaborate on what I mentioned, which I didn't have time to elaborate because time limit. I mean, when people talk about free flow data, a lot of people assume that the free flow data means that there should be absolute free flow data. That is, any type of data should benefit from the free flow data. That is not the case. If you look at the CPTPP and USMCA, which are basically the kind of a gold standard when it comes to free flow data, they do not actually apply to all kinds of data. Instead, as stated very clearly in both agreements, the free flow data will only apply when the free flow of data is necessary for the provision of services or a trade that is covered by the agreement. So in other words, we are only talking about commercial data which are necessary for providing the services or trade covered in the agreement. And this means that the scope is much narrower than most people would think. So I think that could be a good starting point, because if you already agree to cover a specific services or trade in the trade agreement, then you would be expected to allow the flow of data for that specific sector, because otherwise, how could the service providers be able to provide the services? So I would argue that should be the baseline. And in terms of which type of data, where the flow should be restricted, I think the EU's approach is also very interesting, because the EU GDPR only applies to personal data, but it doesn't apply to other types of data. So that could be used also as a baseline. So we all understand that for personal data, it is okay for you to take a stricter approach. But if it's a purely commercial data that has no link with personal data, then why do you impose such a strict requirement? That doesn't make sense. So I think both of these approaches offer interesting lessons that we can learn from in order to reach agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. So it's quite challenging to strike a right balance between the data protection and the data flow liberalization. But I'm sure that there will be a lot of more discussion to be made in the international community, and where you will be a key part of. So with that, I'd like to ask Rupa as our final question, although we cannot cover all the questions posted on the Q&A box due to the time constraint, but perhaps I can, the last opportunity to you to share your views on where the country can start from to develop the digital service trade. Rupa, please.
Sure. So, business will go where there's an opportunity. It doesn't always depend on the government to initiate the process. However, there are two fundamental things. One is the digital infrastructure and connectivity has to be in place, or whether it's mobile. So some ICT infrastructure is necessary. It's a prerequisite. The other is, of course, understanding. So once that is in place, governments need to understand what's the spectrum of digitally deliverable services that are available today and emerging, prospective in future. I think that sort of landscaping is also important, because it's a very fast changing environment. And based on that, they also need to understand what are their competencies. Is it coming out of a cost-based thing? Is it going to come out of geographic and locational advantage? Is it some sort of niche areas that they could probably tap? Are they going to be a global exporter or potentially a regional exporter? I think some sort of understanding of that is also important, because according to that, the alignment of some of the other things that you do follow. While you may have to generally, do something about your startup and regulatory environment, etc., but human capital and skilling. Now, if you're largely going to be a BPO type of services provider, then the scale advantage, the cost advantage becomes perhaps more important. But if you're going to be in niche, very high-end sort of outsourced services, then the domain knowledge and having depth in that would be important. If you want to move up the value chain, then the AI. So the point is that you have to do a sort of SWOT analysis of what the opportunities are, where your competitive advantages lie, and shape those pillars that I talked about accordingly with prioritization. So this is how I would argue, because markets will follow where there are opportunities, but government has to enable that process.
Okay, thank you, Rupa. Thank you very much. So we have spent already, we have used up our allocated time. But although we could not have covered all the questions posed, and then there are still a lot of unanswered questions, but I think that this has been very good opportunity for us to listen to the views and insights of experts in this area. Many of them have contributed to our report already, and then hope that we can take the discussion forward in the future through various venues and avenues in the future. With that, I'd like to thank all the 4 panelists for sharing their views and insights, which have been very beneficial to all of us today. And then with that, I'd like to hand it over to Armen, the organizer. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jane, Rupa, Henry, Oswald, and thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.